This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome back to the UCSF Osher Mini Medical School for the Public's course, Eating for Health and Pleasure, the UCSF Guide to Good Nutrition. Tonight we're joined by Katie Ferraro, Assistant Clinical Professor of Nutrition at both UCSF and the University of San Diego in the School of Nursing. Ms. Ferraro specializes in nutritional education, but her special interests are diabetes and dietary fiber. Not only does she teach at UCSF and UCSD, but she also consults with the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, and she has a new book titled Dietary for Advanced Practice Nurses, which is going to be released this year. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. As Matt said, my name is Katie, and I'm here on behalf of the University of California at San Francisco School of Nursing. I'm here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is dietary fiber. And thank you all for coming out on this weekday evening to learn a little bit about the nutrient that I call the future. I firmly believe that fiber is the future, and my goal here today is to convince you what fiber can do to help you in your health outcomes as well. I've also had the opportunity to teach with Coursera. Has anyone here taken a massive open online course? A couple hands, okay. Here at UCSF, we're affiliated with Coursera, and I'll be offering a free 6-week nutrition class on diet and disease. So we'll talk a little bit about fiber in that class, but it also includes topics like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and GI health. So I invite you to join us. The next time the course will be offered, it's on a regular basis, but June 24th, the course will be starting. Again, it's 6 weeks and it's free. The last time we offered the class, we had over 60,000 students from over 100 different countries. So it's a really fascinating experience and a great way to learn about dietary practices both here in the United States, but also overseas. So you're all here tonight because you have some degree of interest in achieving wellness. As we know, the combination of a proper diet plus good lifestyle decisions helps to promote optimal wellness. On the flip side, and what we see too often in today's environment, is a poor diet combined with a negative lifestyle and negative lifestyle activities such as smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, or physical inactivity leads to death and disease. Did you know that currently 65% of the world's population lives in countries where overweight and obesity actually kill more people than do underweight? Okay, we're definitely living in a global environment, and that's certainly changing. If you looked a number of decades ago, our primary global problem about malnutrition would have been undernourishment. More people today in this world are overweight than they are underweight. And while underweight and malnutrition are certainly important issues, what we're faced with, especially here in the Western world, is malnutrition that's a result of overweight. And keep in mind that the word mal means bad. So malnutrition is simply poor nutrition. It doesn't necessarily mean undernutrition. Many people in our society today have excess of calories, but the calories that they're getting aren't quality calories. And as a result, they can be overweight or obese and also malnourished. What's this cost of poor nutrition? Increased risk for chronic disease, reduced quality of life, and of course there's a significant financial impact. So what can be done? I maintain that the future of nutrition and good health in this country is held in the future of fiber. In today's lecture, I want to introduce you to the what, why, where, and how of dietary fiber. We'll do a brief overview as far as what dietary fiber is, and then I want to convince you, based on 5 different conditions or disease states, how important fiber is for promoting optimal health. We'll look at where we find fiber in the diet, what are good sources of fiber, what are not so good sources of fiber, and we'll highlight what I like to call the fake fibers, foods that are traditionally low in fiber that manufacturers are increasingly sneaking fiber into. Are those good for us or not good for us? We'll look at those, and we'll finish off with how can you meet your own individual fiber needs? How much fiber do you need, and how do you get to that goal? You might be interested to know that the average American needs roughly, no pun intended, 30 grams of fiber per day. How many grams of fiber do you think the average American needs? Any guesses? More or less than 30? Certainly less. Statistics differ, but it's somewhere between 10 to 15 grams a day. So, depending upon what study you look at, we're either eating, as a nation, 1/3 of the amount of the fiber we need, or 1/2 of the amount of the fiber that we need. Bottom line, the majority of people in this country are not getting enough dietary fiber. One of the reasons why I love talking about fiber is because, as a dietitian, you sometimes get a bad rap as the food police. Oh, dietitians just tell me what not to eat. Don't eat hamburgers, don't eat French fries, don't eat ice cream. Don't you have anything positive to say? And my answer to that is yes. We can all stand to eat more fiber. What is fiber? It is the plant matter of foods that is not digestible by our human digestive enzymes. Now, certain types of fiber can be fermented or digested by the bacteria in our gut. Okay, so perhaps during the low-carb phase, you heard of the term called net carbs. Okay, and net carbs were a fancy way for manufacturers to sell carbohydrate-containing foods that had less carbs, perhaps, than their competitors. All net carbs is simply the total amount of carb in a food minus the amount of fiber, provided that there's 5 grams or more per serving. Because we don't actually get calories or energy from the fiber in foods that we eat. But fibers are technically carbohydrates. They can be polysaccharides, such as celluloses, and cellulose is the main constituent of plant cell walls, found in foods like vegetables, fruits, and legumes. They can be hemicelluloses, the main part of cereal fibers. They can be pectins, which are found naturally in fruits and vegetables, but increasingly found as stabilizers in manufactured foods. They can be things like mucilages or gums, which are also used as additives, stabilizers in manufactured and processed foods. We also have lignans, which are non-polysaccharides. That's the tough, woody part of plants. And I think the best example of that is you think of the strings of celery. Okay? That's a high roughage food. It contains primarily lignans. Okay? Fibers can be classified as being either soluble or insoluble. And you've probably heard of those terms. Before I introduce the difference, I do just want to give it with the caveat that too often consumers and patients and clients are overly concerned about, should I eat more soluble or should I eat more insoluble fiber? And my advice to you is don't split hairs. Eat more fiber in general, and you'll naturally consume more soluble as well as more insoluble fiber. I think the perfect example of this is an apple. An apple is a great 80 to 100 calorie snack that contains about 4 grams of fiber. 2 of those are soluble and 2 of those are insoluble. If you increase your amount of naturally occurring sources of fiber across the board, you'll automatically be getting more soluble and more insoluble fiber. But having said that, soluble fibers are the types that dissolve in water. They are able to form gels, and they become viscous. This is the type of fiber that's digested or fermented by the bacteria in our gut. It's in foods like oats and apples and beans. But the skins of apples also have insoluble fiber as well. If you had to boil it down to explain the heart health or the health benefits of soluble fiber, I like to say that this is the one that helps us most with our heart. You'll see in a moment that insoluble fibers do play a role in heart health, but our soluble fibers primarily help us with our heart health, whereas our insoluble fibers primarily help us with our gut health. So if you take perhaps a fiber supplement to help promote regularity with bowel movements, that's likely, or it is containing primarily insoluble fiber. Again, the insoluble fibers help us with our gut. They don't dissolve in water, and they don't form gels. So that's the what of fiber, okay? But why do we need to get more fiber? I'd like to pose the answer to this question by looking at the 5 different conditions that you see up here. In the coming minutes, I want to show you the documented research and evidence we have showing that dietary fiber can help reduce rates of heart disease. It can help improve blood sugar control in people who have diabetes. It can also help people who have pre-diabetes prevent from progressing to full-blown diabetes. It helps with your gut as far as alleviating things like constipation, hemorrhoids, and even helping to lower our risk of colon cancer. As far as cancer goes, there's very little that we know definitively about the role between diet and cancer. But we're pretty sure that a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables, i.e. fiber, helps protect against certain types of cancer, and most notably, colorectal cancer. And then lastly, we'll talk about the role that fiber plays on weight. We live in what we call an obesogenic environment. 2/3 of the country in the United States are either overweight or obese. And many of those people have low fiber diets. So let's start with heart health. As I mentioned, soluble fiber is the one that's most associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Those viscous, soluble fibers that we see in certain foods like oats and apples help to reduce our LDL cholesterol, and that's our bad cholesterol levels. You can think L for lousy or L for less healthy, okay? We want those lousy cholesterol levels to be low. So a diet that contains decent amounts of soluble fiber helps to lower our LDL levels. Now, the heart healthy benefits of a high soluble fiber diet don't occur independently. They occur alongside a diet that's low in saturated fat and trans fat. So how does soluble fiber help reduce the risk of heart disease? It helps improve high lipid or high cholesterol levels through 3 combined effects. And I'll go through each of these independently, but as an overview, soluble fibers help to delay gastric emptying, to increase our excretion of bile acids, and to reduce our liver's ability or our liver's production of cholesterol. So we'll start first with gastric emptying. Okay? Soluble fiber helps you feel full for longer. So it can help from a weight standpoint, and we'll get to that in a moment. But one of the reasons why that happens is because foods that contain fiber take longer to digest than do fiber-free foods. This helps to play a role on satiety and weight control. While there are certainly healthy-weighted people who do develop heart disease, we know that being overweight or obese increases the risk of developing certain types of heart disease. It's also perhaps the case that the role of soluble fiber on reducing on the rate of gastric emptying may play a role on insulin sensitivity. And to put this into perspective as far as a food-based relationship for you, I want you to compare 2 types of breakfasts. Okay? As a dietitian, I hear people say sometimes, you know, I've heard that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. But when I eat breakfast, I actually end up getting hungrier later in the day, so I've just decided to cut breakfast out. Okay? So I ask them, well, what are you eating for breakfast? Look at the breakfast on the left. That is a highly refined, processed, low fiber, low protein breakfast. The 2 things that help keep us full for the longest period of time are fiber and protein. So if you have a white bagel with jelly on it, so sugar on top of other sugar, you're gonna eat that. It might be 300 calories. You're gonna feel full for a short period of time. Your body's gonna convert that to the sugars that the foods are comprised of. It's gonna exit your stomach pretty quickly, and yes, you are gonna feel hungry pretty shortly after eating a 300-calorie breakfast. Now contrast that with the breakfast on the right. That's a whole wheat bagel. You might have noticed it's gone down to a half of a bagel. Our bagels today are getting bigger and bigger, right? A half of a bagel is pretty much sufficient for most of us at breakfast, especially if we add a high fiber, high protein condiment such as peanut butter. Now keep in mind there's fat in there too, and fat certainly does help make you feel fuller for longer. But the breakfast on the right is a much wiser choice, due in large part to its fiber content. It takes you longer to digest the 300 calories from the breakfast on the right due to the fact that there's soluble and insoluble fibers in that whole wheat bagel, as well as, to a lesser degree, some fiber in the nuts in the peanut butter. So when you're going to pick your breakfast, keep in mind fat, but more so protein and fiber as far as helping you stay full for a longer period of time. If you eat cereals, you might notice that if you eat breakfast like Special K or Rice Krispies, those are fat-free, they don't have added sugar. If you put some milk on it, you get a little bit of protein. But those are low fiber cereals, 0 or 1 gram of fiber per serving. A better recommendation is to look for a cereal that contains 3 or more grams of fiber per serving. A little bit more fiber will help you stay fuller for longer. You have to watch out for added sugars. If you have to add a whole bunch of sugar to your cereal to make the fiber palatable, that's not a good thing either. A good rule of thumb is to look for a cereal that has 3 grams of fiber or more and 5 grams of sugar or less. It might take you a little while in the cereal aisle to identify the 1 or 2 cereals out there that meet that profile, but I guarantee you, you only have to do it once, and that breakfast will keep you going and keep you feeling fuller for longer than if you were to have the lower fiber cereals. So in addition to affecting our rate of gastric emptying, soluble fiber also helps to increase the excretion of bile acids. And the way you can remember this is I think of S for soluble and S for sponge. Soluble fiber acts like a sponge. It soaks up the bad cholesterol and takes it out of our body. Okay? It essentially reduces the rate of bile acid recycling. The loss of the bile acids in your stools stimulate your liver, in turn, to increase their uptake from circulation to replenish the supply. And what this ends up doing is reducing the amount of LDL cholesterol circulating in your blood. And that's what we want, right? Lower levels of LDL. So essentially, soluble fiber, in a very oversimplified explanation, soaks up the bad cholesterol and takes it out when you go to the bathroom. On top of that, we've got soluble fiber working for us on a third front. Soluble fiber, through its digestion, we don't actually get calories from it, but our bodies, the bacteria in our gut, can ferment soluble fiber and puts off a byproduct, a short-chain fatty acid. And these short-chain fatty acid byproducts of soluble fiber fermentation actually travel up to your liver and basically tell your liver, hey, stop making so much cholesterol. Maybe you've seen those cholesterol medication commercials that say, our drug treats the 2 sources of cholesterol, your diet and your family, okay? Of course you can change your diet, but you can't change your family. The point there is, if you don't feel like changing your diet and you still have high likelihood for high cholesterol, take our drug and it will bring your cholesterol down. But did you know that through changes in your diet, namely by increasing the amount of soluble fiber in your diet, you can actually inadvertently convince your liver to make less cholesterol internally? Now, insoluble fiber is not without its own heart health benefits. Insoluble fiber also helps to promote heart health. Its relationship is linked more to the bulk of our stools. In a perfect world with regards to gut health and eventually heart health, you want heavy, bulky stools that travel easily through the lower part of your digestive tract so that you can have regular bowel movements. Insoluble fiber is also linked to reductions in cardiovascular disease risk by, like soluble fiber to some degree, promoting satiety. If you feel fuller for longer, you'll eat less frequently, but more importantly, you'll avoid overeating, and you'll have a greater likelihood of maintaining a healthy weight, which in turn helps lower your risk of heart disease. Insoluble fiber may also help to lower blood pressure and the risk of blood clots. It also lowers inflammation. So foods that we find insoluble fiber in, like whole wheat flour, wheat bran, nuts, and beans and vegetables, you're increasingly hearing about an anti-inflammatory diet. Oh, that's something new, an anti-inflammatory diet. It's nothing new. For years, these healthy foods have worked against inflammation. Higher rates of inflammation are associated with higher rates of heart disease. So what does our government say about all of this stuff? Can they put on food labels, or do they endorse the placement of statements on food labels about the health benefits of a high-fiber diet? Well, in typical government fashion, they do, but in a very long-winded way. As you can see from this slide, this is the statement that the United States Food and Drug Administration has approved with regards to fiber and health. It looks very long at first, but I'll help you break it down, and you'll see that it covers much of what we've already talked about. The FDA approves this claim that diets low in saturated fat and cholesterol and rich in fruits, vegetables, and grain products that contain some type of dietary fiber, and particularly soluble fiber, may reduce the risk of heart disease. And then they cover their tail by saying a disease that's associated with, of course, many factors. Now, what does this mean? Fruits and vegetables and grain products should say whole grain products, but those are foods that are naturally high in fiber and low in saturated fat. The types of fiber that they're particularly high in are soluble fiber. And that, combined, of course, with healthy lifestyle choices and a low-fat and saturated fat diet, may help reduce the risk of heart disease. So what does that mean to us as consumers? When you walk into your grocery store, it's good to keep in mind that the front of a food package is its commercial. Okay? We buy foods based on what we see facing us on the aisle. Very few of us, but perhaps many of you in the audience, because you're here at a nutrition lecture, are enticed to buy a product by taking it, turning it around, and reading the nutrition facts panel. Okay? And manufacturers, of course, know that. That's why they don't put it front and center. The front of your product is what sells your product. And I put the example of oatmeal up here. An excellent breakfast, provided that you don't add a whole bunch of extra sugar to it. These are Quaker quick cooking oats. A half of a cup of this product has 4 grams of fiber. 2 grams are soluble and 2 grams are insoluble. You'll note that there's a very large, well, relatively large heart icon at the bottom of that package. The notion there, of course, being to drive the mind association in the consumer that this product helps reduce the risk of heart disease. But on this package somewhere, they have to have that FDA statement that I just showed on the previous slide. Okay? And what it says here is that oatmeal helps reduce cholesterol. Okay? Because this is a food that is low in fat and saturated fat and is a good source of fiber, particularly soluble fiber. I mentioned the apple having 4 grams of fiber, 2 soluble and 2 insoluble. Same thing goes with the oatmeal. Oatmeal's a great breakfast food to have if you're interested in kind of increasing your health profile across the board. You get 2 grams of soluble fiber and 2 grams of insoluble fiber. You'll note that 1/2 cup of this product has 150 calories. That's a 1/2 cup dry. A great breakfast that I recommend for many patients and clients, if they like oatmeal, is to take a 1/2 cup of dry oatmeal and add a cup of some sort of milk or milk alternative. A cup of skim milk, a cup of no added sugar soy milk or almond milk or rice milk, whatever you're fancy, provided that there's a little bit of protein. Now, almond and rice milk tend to be lower in protein than is cow's milk or soy milk. But if you do that cup of oatmeal, half a cup of oatmeal with a cup of milk, and add maybe even a 1/2 cup of fruit, you've got an excellent breakfast, somewhere around 300 calories, 300 to 350, depending on what type of fruit. You've got protein from your milk product, you've got fiber from your oatmeal, and a little bit of extra fiber from your fruit. A good breakfast at a good calorie level that'll keep you feeling full for a pretty good amount of time. People say, well, what about those packets? That only has 150 calories in it. But if you look at the serving size of how much oatmeal you're actually getting in a pre-packaged product, because the majority of them have sugar added to them to make them taste good, right? Those products tend to have actually less oatmeal. They cut the serving size down and add the sugar, and the total calories would equal 150. So they're actually not created equal. And of course, those products are convenient, but so are quick cooking oats. They take exactly the same amount of time to prepare as do the ones in the packet. And if you add the milk and the fruit as mentioned, you really end up with a healthier alternative than if you're dealing with the prepackaged products. So real briefly, I do want to just show you that we have a good amount of convincing evidence to back up these claims with regards to fiber and heart disease. I want to highlight a study that was published a long time ago, but it's still very relevant and quite often cited in the world of heart disease prevention. And that's a study that was done at Harvard in 1986. The sample size was roughly 44,000 US male health professionals, and they were aged 40 to 75, and they were free from any diagnosed heart disease or diabetes. As is the case with many nutrition studies, it's hard to know exactly every single item that you have eaten in every eating incident over the course of your entire life. Okay? A lot of this is guesswork, but we have to use questionnaires, and there's some very impressive ways to develop and validate food questionnaires such that we can get an idea of, on average, how much fiber you're eating, how much fat you're eating, and so on and so forth. So in this study, the doctors were given a questionnaire that contained 131 questions. And after a 6-year follow-up period, the researchers found an inverse association between the doctor's fiber intake and heart attack risk. And they concluded that the highest group, so the high total dietary fiber intake groups, were linked to having a 40% lower risk of developing coronary heart disease. And this was particularly seen among cereal fiber and the fibers from grains. You'll see that in some of the subsequent studies, that fruits and vegetables are good, but if we can replace our refined grains with whole grains, we'll really do a whole lot to help prevent the onset of heart disease. So that's our first why. Heart disease, the #1 killer of both Americans, males and females, strongly linked perhaps to the types of fiber that's in our diet. But what about diabetes? Also a top 10 killer of Americans. Many people who have diabetes are at risk for developing heart disease. Many people with heart disease also have diabetes. We call these comorbidities. Fiber is important in diabetes because of blood sugar control. Now, whether or not you have diabetes, we all would like to have pretty steady blood sugar control. It's not fun to peak and crash and peak and crash. You know that feeling. You're starving before lunch. You eat a big lunch, a lot of sugar or carbs. You sit down at your desk after that big lunch and you want to do what? Fall asleep, okay? Sugar high, and you wait too long because you feel so full. Oh, I blew it today at lunch. I'm going to wait a really long time to eat again. Your sugar dips really, really low, especially if you didn't have much fiber in that lunch, and you kind of feel not so great throughout the day. But for people with diabetes, it's particularly important that they avoid those peaks and those dips in their blood sugar. We know that fiber in the diet leads to a less marked increase in blood sugar and less demand for insulin. The satiating effect, so satiety is the feeling of fullness. We've mentioned that eating fiber makes you feel full. It's extremely important in diabetes. If you look at all the people who have diabetes, okay, 90 to 95% of them have type 2 diabetes. And of the people that have type 2 diabetes, 90 to 95% of them are overweight or obese. So when we talk about diabetes and a diet for diabetes, more often than not, with the exception of type 1 diabetes, we're talking about weight management. And so promoting a high fiber diet that helps make you feel fuller for longer is important for helping individuals achieve and maintain a healthy weight in order to help reduce the really negative side effects of uncontrolled diabetes. We have research showing that fiber is helpful in preventing diabetes, but also in helping to mitigate those blood sugar peaks and dips in people who already have diagnosed diabetes. We have 2 different studies here, one published in 1986 and another in 1987, looking at pretty large sample sizes, greater than 60,000 US women and greater than 40,000 US men. All of these people in the study, this cohort, had no cardiovascular disease, no cancer, and no diabetes. And the researchers found that those who reported, now of course this is self-reported data, so there are some inherent problems there, but in big sample sizes like this, we can pretty much assume that those who ate the most fiber from grains, roughly 8 grams a day, had a 30% lower risk of diabetes than the group who ate the least amount of fiber. Because of course, a low fiber diet tends to be one that's associated high intakes of meat, high intakes of dairy, high intakes of added fat and added sugars. Another study in 2007 looked at 15,000 men and women aged 35 to 65 with an average follow-up of 7 years. That's a pretty impressive sample size as well as time period for a study like this. They were also administered a questionnaire about their dietary intake. And the researchers found in their results that those who ate the most cereal fiber, on average of 16.5 grams per day, had a 27% lower risk of type 2 diabetes than those who ate the least. Now, in a moment, we'll get to what foods have what amount of fiber, but if you keep in mind that a piece of whole wheat bread has about 3 grams of fiber, this is the equivalent of having roughly 5 pieces of whole wheat bread. and hopefully you have some other whole grains in there, it's actually not a whole lot considering the amount of grain products that Americans on average eat. What about for people who already have diabetes? In 2000, there was a study published that was a randomized crossover study. Very, very small sample size, but I bring it up to show you, namely, how difficult it is to conduct some of these intervention trials. It was only 13 patients, but it took people who already had diagnosed type 2 diabetes and randomized them into one of two diet groups. They put them on, the half of the people went on a moderate fiber diet. Okay, now, we mentioned that most Americans only eat 10 to 15 grams a day, and in this study, they ate 24 grams a day. So the researcher's choice of the word moderate is rather interesting, because for most Americans, that's a really high fiber diet. Regardless, 24 grams a day, 8 grams soluble and 16 grams insoluble. The other group that was randomized to, they went to a diet that had a high fiber diet, and that was 50 grams of fiber, 25 soluble and 25 insoluble. And note that in these studies, as with almost all studies you see about fiber and health, they're looking at fiber from foods, okay? Naturally occurring sources of fiber in our diet. Not fiber from supplements, not fiber that's been added into Fiber One bars or Skinny Cow ice cream bars, but real fiber that we get in fruits and vegetables and whole grain bread products. In this study, after 6 weeks, which to control the actual diet of a group of 13 people for 6 weeks is pretty impressive, they found that the high fiber diet group's mean preprandial, so before meal blood glucose levels, were 13 points higher than the group who had the moderate amount of fiber. The key in this study is that the high fiber group is eating way more fiber than what most health professional groups recommend. Most groups recommend eat 30 grams a day, acknowledging that we only eat 10 or 15. But in this study, they were pushing it as high as 50. So that a very high fiber diet might actually, while it sounds very aggressive, be the most effective at helping to lower blood sugar levels in people who already have diabetes. An added effect is that it also helped to reduce cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels. Question? Okay, so the question is, regarding that statistic, that's a very shocking statistic that 90 to 95% of people with type 2 diabetes do have overweight or obesity. And I actually, as a certified diabetes educator, always double question that stat. And I looked it up right before the class as well, and I'd be happy to share the statistic with you. You mentioned that you work a lot with people who have diabetes. Again, if you work with people who have type 1 diabetes, you're much more likely to encounter underweight or healthy weighted individuals, although there's certainly people with type 1 diabetes who are overweight or obese, just as there is the case that people who have type 2 can be healthy weighted or even underweight. But the reality is that those statistics reflect our general population statistics. The majority of those people do have overweight and obesity. With regards to gut health, our next point, you're probably familiar about the role that dietary fiber plays in helping to lower the risk of certain gastrointestinal disorders. Without getting into too much detail or very graphic images, I have a nice cartoon here for you to kind of tone it down. Dietary fiber plays an important role in our colon, or our large intestine. It helps to reduce the rates of diverticulosis. Now, diverticulosis is simply the presence of having diverticula, which are outpouchings that you see there on the side of the walls of the large intestine. What I like to think about it is if you don't exercise your colon with a high fiber diet, it gets lazy. And the walls get lazy and they easily sag outward, forming these diverticula. Now, many people walk around with diverticulosis, especially older people, and it's not that big of a deal. What we are concerned about, however, is when the diverticula become inflamed, either with food or stool, and cause diverticulitis. Itis means inflammation. So again, osis is just the presence of having diverticula. And the recommendations for diverticulosis have changed over, I would say, about the past decade. If you had a diagnosis of diverticulosis about 10 years ago, your gastroenterologist would likely tell you, oh, you gotta be on a low fiber diet. No seeds, no nuts, nothing that could get stuck in those diverticula. And what that actually was serving to do was to increase rates of diverticulosis, because we now know that a diet that's high in fiber essentially exercises your gut or your colon walls and helps reduce the likelihood of those outpouchings. Now, if you are in the unfortunate condition of going into diverticulitis, In that case, we go on a very, very low fiber diet. We're usually hospitalized for that and on total gut rest, usually fed intravenously until that inflammation subsides. But for the good majority of the time, people with diverticular disease should actually be following a high fiber diet. A high fiber diet also helps prevent against constipation, hemorrhoids, and colon cancer. Which leads me to our next condition, cancer. We know that a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables is protective against many types of cancer. But that's about as far as researchers will go in linking diet and cancer, because there's just still too many unknowns about what causes or what exacerbates or initiates cancer or promotes cancer. The World Cancer Research and the Research Fund, and the American Institute for Cancer Research have put together this graphic to kind of show the three components that are most important for cancer prevention. And that's the combination of maintaining a healthy weight, so it says aim to be at a healthy weight throughout your life. The diet component, choose mostly plant foods and limit your red meat and avoid processed meats. And then, of course, the physical activity component. Be physically active every day in any way that you can for 30 minutes or more. We oftentimes encounter people who really will nitpick and fine-tune their diet down to that last milligram or kilocalorie, and yet they're forgetting the other portion of the spectrum, which is physical activity. If we look at the World Cancer Research Fund, they have these 12 primary recommendations, and I know the print is small on your slides, but I'd be happy to send you the link to this, or you can look it up. But of the 5 dietary recommendations that they make, and these are global and American cancer prevention groups getting together and actually agreeing on something, they say that of the 5 dietary changes you can make, I'd like you to note that each of them to some degree does implicate fiber. We see 5 a day. Aim for 5 servings of fruits or vegetables a day. Okay? Shake off the salt. Well, fruits and vegetables are naturally low sodium foods, as are legumes and most whole grains. Stay out of the red, meaning avoid or limit the amount of red meat and processed meats that you eat. Meats contain no fiber. Not so sweet, stay away from added or refined sugars. We tend to find refined sugars in a lot of our refined bread products. And then good for the gut. When you eat grains, aim to make them whole grains, which of course are better sources of fiber than our refined grains. We want you to get sweaty, okay? Exercising is great, but if you're walking and I call you on your cell phone and you can talk to me in a normal voice without huffing and puffing, are you really exercising at your max capacity? Not exactly. So we like to say get sweaty or get ugly. Now, of course, there's certain medical conditions where people can't get ugly for 30 minutes, but once it's cleared by your primary care provider, if you're exercising, you should be aiming to get your heart rate up if it's safe. Know your limit with regards to alcohol. I'll show you in a minute, but alcohol, if we do know one thing about diet and cancer, it's that a diet that's high in alcohol or excessive amounts of alcohol actually promotes cancer. Watch your sun exposure. Quit smoking. Here's our lifestyle stuff. Downsize your weight, which a high fiber diet can help do that. Get vaccinated and then stay away from certain environmental factors. This is another slide that's a little bit difficult to see, but again, I'd be happy to send you the original reference. And what it's showing here is a summary of what are considered to be, again, from the American Institute of Cancer Research and then the World Cancer Fund, convincing and probable judgments about the relationship between the things you see here on the y-axis and then the different types of cancer. And the ones I want to point out are that non-starchy vegetables and fruits, they say, have at the bottom here, convincing decreased risk for decreasing the risk of the development of cancers of the mouth, pharynx, and larynx, the esophagus, the lungs, stomach, and colorectal cancer. So again, a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables convincingly has been shown to decrease those certain types of cancer. Whereas red meat and processed meat actually increase your risk of colorectal cancer. So researchers go back and forth about diet and cancer. Sometimes you hear diet and colon cancer. Sometimes you hear fruits and vegetables help protect against colon cancer. And then another study will come out and say, it's not as protective as we thought it was. You'll see another study come out and say, people that eat a lot of red meat have higher rates of colon cancer. And that's generally because high red meat intake is correlated with low fruits and vegetables. But then you'll have another study that say, never mind, it's not as convincing as we probably thought it was beforehand. But what you'll notice that there's never been a study that says eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and not eating a lot of meat increases your risk of colon cancer, because it doesn't. Okay? We don't know exactly to what degree fruits and vegetables help protect against colon cancer, but we know that they certainly don't increase the risk. They also help reduce the risk of the development of other types of cancer. Physical activity also decreases the risk, convincing decreased risk for the development of colorectal cancer. And having high levels of body fat has been shown to, on the bright pink, or dark pink rather, bars, show a convincing increased risk for the development of colorectal cancer. So if you're at risk for colorectal cancer, and the older you get, you are, dependent upon your genetics, you are, and if you're a male, you're at higher risk than our females, you should be concerned about keeping your fruits and vegetables high, reducing your reliance on animal meats and high-fat dairy, getting as much physical activity you can, and getting rid of excess body fat. So how do we eat to prevent cancer? Long before the My Plate visual came out from the USDA in 2011, the World Cancer Research Fund had what was called the New American Plate. And what you'll note here is that they advocate a diet where 2/3 of your plate is occupied, or more, by vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans. And those are legume beans. Green beans are good, but legumes are even higher in fiber and certain antioxidants. And that 1/3 of your plate, or less, should be occupied by animal protein if you eat it, or other types of protein. But regardless, we really want to focus on the animal protein. So this is geared primarily at meat eaters. Now, if you're familiar with My Plate, half the plate is fruits and vegetables. People say, oh, get your act together. Is it 1/3 of the plate or is it a half a plate? Just should be fruits and vegetables. It doesn't matter, because we should be shifting the way our plates look. Because to be honest, the way we're served at restaurants, and 50% of our food dollar is now spent on food purchased and prepared outside of the home, a lot of people are eating the way restaurants tell them to eat. They don't know how to put together a plate that consists primarily of fruits and vegetables, and that's low on refined grains, if any, and low on animal protein. Lastly, as to if you're not convinced already that you need to eat more fiber for your health, fiber helps with weight management. It promotes satiety. Satiety is certainly becoming a buzzword. Lots of food manufacturers are adding fiber into traditionally low-fiber foods and saying, these are satiety enhancing, these are satiating, they will make you feel fuller for longer, okay? But fiber does just that. But you don't need to buy any fancy protein shake or snack bar or frozen ice cream bar to get your fiber and your satiety, because foods like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, and nuts and seeds to a lesser degree promote satiety. Basically because fiber helps absorb water from the digestive juices in your gut, swells your stomach, delays hunger, and over time can help reduce food intake. Fiber-rich foods often also have the added benefit of being low in fats and added sugars. And we have research showing that people who eat 3 or more servings of whole grains per day have lower body and abdominal fatness over time. So if fiber is so great for us and we know we need to get more of it, where do we find it in the diet? Okay. You see here a list of foods that contain fiber: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and foods that don't contain fiber: meat, cheese, dairy and eggs, oil and fats, most beverages, and refined grain products. Now, if you take out refined grain products and maybe beverages, those first 3 bullet points are a pretty big component of most low-carbohydrate diets. Now, low-carbohydrate diets, like the Atkins diet, come in and out of favor. Guaranteed you'll see 2 or 3 more cycles of low-carb diets in your lifetime. And if you look at the foods that low-carb dieters eat, they are meats, cheese, dairy and eggs, oil and fats. They don't eat fruits because they have carbs. They don't eat a lot of vegetables. They might eat some of the lower carb ones. They definitely don't eat whole grains, and stay away from legumes. Too much carb. But if you'll note, all the foods that people on low-carb diets eat are low in fiber. People on low-carb diets tend to be irritable for a number of reasons, but I would argue that one of the primary reasons is because they're fairly constipated. Look at the foods that they're eating: meat, cheese, dairy, eggs, oil, and fats. Not to mention that those are foods that are traditionally high in saturated fat, which increase the risk of heart disease. But they're also foods that are totally devoid of fiber. When we look at whole grains, we look at the entire grain, hence the name whole grain. And that is comprised of three primary components. Maybe you've seen this slide. This is the anatomy of a whole grain. When we eat a whole grain product, we get the benefits of the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. The bran is the protective outer shell where all the fiber is, as well as some B vitamins. The endosperm is that starchy, white, fluffy part that contains mostly starch, a little bit of protein, and some vitamins and minerals. And then in the middle, we have the germ. Okay? The germ is the seed for a new plant. It contains B vitamins, some protein, minerals, and some healthy oils. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, almost everybody, if they ate grain products, ate whole grain products. But once millers realized, if I can throw out the bran and throw out the germ, I get this nice, white, fluffy bread product. And actually, at its inception, white bread was considered to be an elitist food. Of course, we don't necessarily think about it that way anymore, but when it was new, this was something that was reserved for the upper classes. And lower class people ate refined bread, sometimes referred to as, they ate whole grain breads, which was sometimes referred to as peasant bread. Manufacturers love refined white bread. The germ, if you'll note, has fat. Anytime you have fat in a product, it goes rancid more quickly than does its refined counterpart. Okay? If you've traveled to Europe and you bought a great loaf of whole wheat bread, you put it on the counter, you come back a day later, what happened to it? It's moldy, it's rotten. Okay? They don't put as many preservatives in their bread in the other parts of the world as we do here. But it's due in large part to the fat. The fat in a whole grain product will cause it to go rancid more quickly. You throw that fat-containing component, i.e. the germ, out, you get a product with a longer shelf life that I can hold on to for longer and sell. Also remove the bran, we took out all the fiber. What we also did, though, was remove all the important nutrients. So when we started to see some micronutrient deficiencies come about, when people were eating lots of white bread, the government mandated, hey, we need to add back into our refined bread products all of these nutrients we stripped away. Iron, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin. And then in 1996, folic acid was added to help prevent against neural tube defects. But if you'll note, even though we added back all of the important nutrients into our refined wheat breads, we didn't add any fiber back. Okay? So when you look at wheat bread and you look at whole wheat bread, keep in mind that wheat bread is just white bread with brown food coloring. Okay? Whole wheat bread is what we're looking for, or 100% whole grain. Now in this country, you can call it 9-grain bread, 11-grain bread, 1,000,000-grain bread. If it doesn't contain whole wheat or 100% whole wheat as the first ingredient in a wheat-based product, it's probably not a great source of fiber because its ingredients are likely led by refined grains. In the United States, remember, manufacturers can pick their serving sizes, so they kind of manipulate calories and fiber that way, but they are required to list ingredients by weight. So whatever ingredient you see listed first, that constitutes the greatest percentage by weight. So we want to look for bread products that have whole wheat in the first ingredient in the ingredient list if we're looking at bread products. Now, we talk a lot about whole grains, but we don't eat that many whole grains as a nation, okay? The top 10 calorie sources in the United States, if you will notice, are foods like grain-based desserts, that's a lot of white flour and sugar and fat, yeast breads, usually white flour, chicken and chicken mixed dishes, that's not low-fat chicken breast, okay? That's the legs, the wings, the thighs, usually with other added high-fat and salt components, and so on and so forth. The majority of the ingredients that we eat are, as the esteemed author Michael Moss recently titled his book, Sugar, Salt, Fat. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend you read Sugar, Salt, Fat by Michael Moss. It does an excellent job of explaining the food manufacturer's role in helping to promote and increase our affinity for these three primary ingredients. And if you look again at many of the foods that Americans are eating, they're comprised largely of sugar, salt, and fat. I mentioned the whole wheat bread product. A good rule of thumb for your breads, just like with your cereals, is to look for a product that has 3 grams of fiber or more per serving. In this product, I have the dietary fiber circled. In about 100 calories of bread, you want to find about 3 grams of dietary fiber. In this product, you see the first ingredient is whole wheat flour. One thing that manufacturers are doing is they're smart. As you, the public, learn about nutrition, they change the rules to confuse what you know. If you see the first word saying refined wheat flour, that's white flour with all those micronutrients thrown back in, but no added fiber. Now they might go farther down the list and add some fake fibers, which I'll mention in a second. But consumers are starting to learn, if sugar is high up in the ingredient list, I shouldn't eat it. So we say, sugar shouldn't be the second ingredient maybe in your bread product. In this case, it's water followed by sugar. But what manufacturers do now is they write in a white bread or wheat bread product, refined wheat flour, open parentheses, iron, comma, riboflavin, comma, niacin, comma, all the stuff that they have to add to refined wheat flours, close parentheses, and then put sugar. Your eye sees it and thinks, oh, sweet, sugar's the 7th ingredient in this item. But it's not. It's the 2nd ingredient in that item. If you bake bread, you know that sugar, of course, plays a role in making bread, but we really don't need the high rates of high fructose corn syrup that we see in today's bread. If you go to the bread aisle in your typical grocery store, you're hard-pressed to find a whole wheat bread product that doesn't have a lot of high fructose corn syrup. There's a couple brands out there, and without mentioning names, there's about 1 or 2 in the Bay Area in a traditional grocery store. Now, if you're in a specialty store, you have a lot better options, a lot perhaps healthier options, but most Americans don't shop in food environments like people in the Bay Area do. They're at the bread aisle in a big, massive grocery store, and most of those breads are made with refined grains and a lot of high fructose corn syrup. So, in addition to whole wheat breads, what are some other whole grain products we can be trying out? Don't limit yourself to whole wheat. There are wonderful sources of whole grain, especially for those of you who might be following a gluten-free diet. If you've been recently diagnosed with celiac disease or have gluten intolerance, you're likely exploring some of the gluten-free options as far as whole grains go. Think of reducing your reliance on refined wheat products as an opportunity to increase your reliance on some of these different types of whole grains. I add wild rice there. Wild rice is technically a plant, not a grain, but wild rice is a better source of B vitamins and fiber than is white rice. We've got a couple questions sometimes about what I call the whole grain tweeners. They're kind of in between whole grains and refined grains. What's the deal with, for example, barley? Okay. Pearled barley is not a whole grain since during the processing of that product, some of the bran is removed. If you eat a cup of cooked pearl barley, you get 200 calories and roughly 6 grams of fiber. 6 grams of fiber is pretty impressive, especially if you compare it to other refined grains. But if you look at dehulled barley, which interestingly enough in some health food stores is actually called hulled barley, so hulled and dehulled is the same thing. I'm not sure how that works. As long as it's not pearled, that's the key. That's a better source of whole grain. Higher content of B vitamins, but also for those 200 calories, you get 10 grams of fiber as compared to 6. So it might sound like splitting hairs, but if you need to eat 30 a day, an additional 4 grams does kind of make a big deal. How about durum wheat? That's the wheat that's high in protein. It's the yellow flour used in making pasta. Durum wheat used in semolina and semolina flour is not whole grain. Okay, but it's very high in protein, so it is beneficial in some ways. But you can also find 100% durum wheat or whole wheat durum that is a whole grain. Not quite whole grains, but still good for you. Legumes, certainly not a grain, but they're high in fiber, high in protein. If you're looking to cut back on your reliance on animal products, legumes are your go-to source for protein and fiber. And those are dried peas and beans, like chickpeas, black beans, garbanzo beans, pinto beans. You ask people, do you like pinto beans? I love pinto beans, especially when they're mashed up with lard and have a lot of salt on them on a burrito, okay? Good rule of thumb with your legumes is you want to identify the whole bean. If you can see the whole bean, it is likely not mashed up with lard and, might be in your burrito or taco, but probably with less calories and salt. Soybeans, chickpeas, oil seeds, and then roots derived from legumes. For example, things like arrowroot. Now, what about these fake fibers? Okay, got it. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds to a lesser degree. Good source of fiber. But we're seeing fiber in all sorts of foods where fiber didn't used to be. I hate to pick on Fiber One, but as we say about Fiber One bars, if it looks like a cookie and it tastes like a cookie, it's a cookie, okay? So the other day I was working with a client and it was a mom and a daughter, and the daughter was in 7th grade, and the mom couldn't understand why the daughter had all these gut issues. And in doing one 24-hour recall, the girl eats 3 Fiber One bars a day, okay? That's a lot of added inulin, which comes from chicory root, which in small quantities for most people, particularly adults, we can tolerate it. But in a young developing person at very high rates like that, there can be some pretty negative side effects. Not to mention, what healthy foods are those 3 fiber 1 bars per day displacing? More importantly, why is a mom giving what's traditionally a diet food for an adult to a kid? So a lot of issues going on with that one. That's a work in progress. But as far as these isolated fibers, they're sometimes referred to as functional fibers. Again, I call them fake fibers because you find them in foods that, to be honest, you shouldn't be eating a whole lot to begin with. If I'm going to eat ice cream, I want to eat good ice cream. But some people are eating products like, for example, these ice cream bars because they see 3 grams of fiber per serving. The dietitian said, look for 3 grams of fiber or more per serving. A couple years ago, that was a safe bet and a good recommendation to make. Not anymore, because now we see foods with a lot of added sugars that also have these added fibers in them. Okay, they're fibers from other plant sources, so they're not technically fake, but they don't belong in the foods that they're put in. Yogurt. Yogurt is a fiber-free food. It's a dairy food. No dairy foods have fiber in them. But now we see cottage cheese with fiber, we see yogurt with fiber, but you know what? You have to add a lot of sugar to make that fiber palatable, at which point you're kind of erasing the health benefits of the calcium, the protein, and the fiber that you're adding in there. My favorite example, and not to pick on General Mills, because we'll do a good example of General Mills cereal, not so good one, is Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I don't know if you guys can see the front of that, but it says excellent source or great source or beautiful source of whole grain, plastered all over the front of that. Now, you know, they say if you're going to be something or do something, be the very best at it. If you're going to be a high sugar, low fiber cereal, do it right. And I think if you've had Cinnamon Toast Crunch, that's a delicious tasting cereal. But you do not buy it for its high fiber benefits. And yet, there they are plastering it all over the front of that product. And we're going to look in a second a little bit more closely at how can a manufacturer make that claim on the front of a product that we know is really not a health food, especially when it's marketed at parents who are perhaps buying this because they think it's a good source of whole grain for their kids. Some of the most commonly seen isolated fibers in our food supply these days, you see ingredients like maltodextrin, inulin, which I mentioned comes from chicory root, polydextrose, oat fiber, resistant starch, pectin, and gums. These are naturally occurring fibers from different plants, but manufacturers extract them, put them into foods that technically didn't have fiber in them before, and as I mentioned, oftentimes have to add a lot of sugar, salt, or fat in order to make these kind of unpalatable fibers in those foods taste good. Here's our Cinnamon Toast Crunch again, okay? So we've got this whole grain first ingredient, okay? Again, there's General Mills. They know that consumers, hey, I should look for foods that have whole grains as the first ingredient. So what do? They do put whole grain wheat as the first ingredient. What's the second ingredient? Sugar, okay? In this cereal, you get 3/4 of a cup of cereal for 130 calories, okay? Dietary fiber, 2 grams, so it doesn't pass our 3-gram test, but then they have to add 10 grams of sugar to make that a palatable product, okay? For a child, 10 grams of added sugar is too much, especially to start their day out with. Now, another General Mills product that also contains whole grain first ingredient is regular Cheerios. Now, this is not Honey Nut Cheerios. I'm continually surprised by how many, especially adults, forget about the yellow box of Cheerios, and when you ask them if they like Cheerios, they say, of course I like Cheerios. The Honey Nut is delicious. Honey Nut Cheerios are not traditional Cheerios. And if you look at the label of Honey Nuts, there's a smaller portion size because they add more sugar. The yellow Cheerios are an excellent breakfast decision. 1 cup gets you 100 calories, 3 grams of dietary fiber, and just 1 gram of added sugar, okay? Tends to also be significantly cheaper. A much better product for kids than would be Cinnamon Toast Crunch. This one says more whole grain. It's shaped like a heart. I mean, they're certainly taking liberties with regards to perhaps exploiting that FDA claim, but that is a decent claim on the front for a very different product than the Cinnamon Toast Crunch. And this is actually from their website yesterday, but I just looked, the Cinnamon Toast Crunch at my grocery store today has a huge whole grain banner across the front of it. Okay, and that's perfectly legal, unfortunately, in our food environment. Again, the front of packaging is what sells a product. The side is where you really have to do your investigative research. So, back to the further down, you can see that there's some added, there's rice bran oil added, there's maltodextrin, some of the extra to get the 2 grams of fiber, okay, because such a large percentage of this product is actually sugar. They add more fibers further down the list in order to bump it up. So do these fibers work? Do eating products that have these functional or fake or added fibers added to them, do they give us the same health benefits that we just spent the first 20 minutes of the lecture talking about? And the general consensus is that the jury is still out. we don't know if these foods, whether isolated or functional fibers, provide protection against cardiovascular disease. Whether that is known remains controversial. Longer-term studies of fiber intake, which examine the effect of both intrinsic, that's the intact real fibers that you see, and functional, those are the isolated or added fibers, are required. We've just started seeing these in our food supply lately. Okay, we don't know if they convey the same health benefits, but I think common sense would tell us if we have to refine an ingredient down, strip it of all its nutrition, add fiber from a different source back, and then more sugar, salt, and fat to make it taste good, plus sell it at a higher price point, that's probably not the dietary source of fiber that we want to be looking at. So how can you meet your individual fiber needs? This is the last part of the lecture. How do we do it? Again, the average American eats 10 to 15 grams of fiber a day, and yet we should be having upwards of 30. Pick 30 because, as the government is known to do, they've made the recommendations a little bit confusing. They're gender-based. The reason why you'll note that male fiber needs are higher than females is because for two reasons. The grams of fiber recommended per day are based on 1,000 calorie units. So men tend to have higher calorie needs than do females, but also males are at higher risk for developing colon cancer than are females. So you'll always see fiber recommendations higher for males than for females in the same age and gender group. The Institute of Medicine recommendations for men, age 50 or younger, aim for 38 grams, for women, 25, and then it bumps down a little bit into the 51 or older age, usually because those people are eating less calories. Now you can look online and there's a bunch of other fiber recommendations. Next to this, the one you see probably second most regularly is to aim for 14 grams of fiber per every 1,000 calories you eat. Okay, so if you eat a 2,000 calorie diet, which for some people meets their needs, then that would be 28 grams of fiber. Again, at the end of the day, most people are only getting a third or a half of that, so we have lots of room for improvement. A couple of tips for increasing fiber. You're going to leave this lecture all really ramped up and excited about fiber. The first recommendation is go slow, okay? If you have a low fiber diet, I know you guys don't, but if the rest of the people out there have a low fiber diet and you go from 0 grams today to 30 grams tomorrow, you are going to get some really unintended and not so pleasant GI side effects. Okay, and think about it. If most of the fiber you're eating perhaps is soluble, okay, you didn't have any bacterial action in your gut because you never had any fiber in there. Tomorrow you load it up with 30 grams, all of a sudden you've got all this bacteria showing up to ferment that fiber. A lot of that bacterial activity is going to cause the gas, bloating, abdominal extension, etc., that is affiliated with high fiber intakes. So our recommendation is to just add a few extra grams a day. Okay, take it slow. We're not in a race. You'll get to 30, a few grams a day to make sure you can tolerate it, to kind of train your body to tolerate perhaps a higher fiber diet. There are certain fibers in certain foods, certain sugars that some people just can't digest. I lived for 2.5 years in Nepal, and the diet in Nepal is lentils and rice. And I lived with a very unfortunate woman who came from the United States as well, who couldn't eat lentils. If you can't eat lentils in India or Nepal, you're kind of up a creek, okay? And she would eat a tablespoon, she just couldn't digest it. There's some very, very large sugars in some of those lentil and legumes, as well as some of the cruciferous vegetables like cauliflower and broccoli, that some humans really have trouble digesting. They find that cooking those cruciferous vegetables can help increase your ability to digest it. So maybe you can't eat raw broccoli, but you do better with cooked broccoli. But some people, you just can't tolerate certain high fiber foods. Drink water. If you go up on your fiber, you need to go up on your water, because the last thing you want is a whole mass of fiber sitting in your colon all dried out because there's no water in there to help kind of float it out of the system, okay? A good rule of thumb, 6 to 8 glasses of water a day. Okay, they did an interesting study in the Wall Street Journal, an article a couple years ago, and they looked for the source of that recommendation for why we should drink 8 glasses of water a day. And interestingly enough, nobody can find the source of that recommendation. Just kind of disappeared. It's a nice round number. It kind of equals 2 liters, kind of equals 8 cups. It's a half a gallon. But really for you, a good rule of thumb for your hydration is keep an eye on the color of your urine. Okay, if it's clear or light yellow, you're well hydrated. If it's dark yellow, and particularly if it smells bad, you're not well hydrated, okay? People say, that's urine, it's supposed to smell bad. Your urine is not supposed to smell bad, okay? That is a direct manifestation of concentrated waste product. You better be diluting that with some more water. But especially if you're adding more fiber, go up on your water. We always recommend that you eat your fruit, not drink it. You're going to have the benefit of listening to Dr. Lustig, who will say much along the same lines. But one of the major benefits of eating fruit is getting the fiber from the fruit. If you take the peel and throw it out and take the pulp with all the fiber and throw it out, sure, you get some nutrition, but you tend to get a really concentrated source of fruit sugar, and you just threw all the fiber out by the wayside. Okay? It's a little bit better to blend versus juice, but again, you still have the propensity there to drink way too many calories. Eat your fruit. It takes a lot longer to eat an orange than it does to compress 5 into a juice and chug it. And then lastly, want to make half your grains whole, okay? Especially when you cook at home. Because the reality is we eat at restaurants, we go out, and you're not going to find the whole grains out in the typical marketplace. So the grains that you do eat at home should, as much as possible, be whole grains. We have an interesting new rule. This just kind of came out within the last couple of months. It's what's called Harvard's 10-to-1 rule for choosing grains, and I think it's a really useful tip. It was done on a study. The Harvard researchers evaluated 545 grain products from 2 major grocery store chains, Stop & Shop and Walmart. Okay? They tallied up the grams of whole grain in each product, along with the amounts of carb, fiber, added sugar, trans fat, and sodium, plus the number of calories. And basically what they found was that from those foods, those that met this 10-to-1 ratio, and that means for every 10 grams of carb you eat, you should have at least 1 gram of fiber. Okay? They found that the ones that met the 10-to-1 rule had less sugar, less sodium, and less trans fat than those that didn't. So if we look, for example, at this product on the right, one roll, okay, so the roll has about 100 calories, so that's roughly 1 ounce of bread. It's a pretty small roll. But you see 23 grams of carb and then 5 grams of fiber, okay? So that does meet the 10-to-1 ratio, okay? You want to be under that 10-to-1 ratio. So if it had 50 grams of carb and only 1 gram of fiber, that wouldn't be a good whole grain product. Okay. Now you do want to double check, are they adding a lot of those inulin, maltodextrin, other ingredients I can't pronounce? If they are, maybe that's not the best option. But keep the 10-to-1 rule in mind, just kind of for a quick scan to see if that's a good product. So in conclusion, I just want to show you that you don't have to do anything really fancy or special to get the amount of fiber a day that you need. You don't need to buy special supplements. You don't have to buy special health foods or protein powders or expensive additives or fancy manufactured or processed foods. Here's a sample diet that is an 1,800 calorie diet showing someone who has breakfast, lunch, a dinner, and 2 snacks. Okay? To be honest, this was a diet that I like because I like to have ice cream after dinner before I go to bed. And if you get your 30 grams of fiber in prior to your bedtime snack, you can see ice cream, of course, has no fiber, and yet you still can meet your 33 gram of fiber a day recommendation. A good rule of thumb is every time you eat, try to get 3 to 5 grams of fiber. And if you eat, 4 to 5 times a day with a number of small meals and snacks, you'll easily meet that recommendation. For most people, I like to recommend aiming for 3 servings of fruit a day. Fruits, while they do have a little bit more calories and carb than do non-starchy vegetables, fruits have on average more fiber than do vegetables. So if your average medium to large size piece of fruit has 4 to 5 grams of fiber, and you eat 3 of those a day, you just knocked out half of your fiber needs from your fruit intake alone. And you have to have a couple vegetables, maybe a whole grain here or there, but you'll easily meet that 30-gram recommendation. So in closing, I want to leave you guys with a couple of recommendations, some further reading if you're interested. A great article from the Harvard School of Public Health called Fiber, Start Roughing It. There's certainly no shortage of fiber-related puns out there, but Harvard does a nice job of at least backing it up with some scientific evidence. The American Heart Association promotes whole grains and fiber, but I would advise you to not fall for the American Heart Association check mark. Companies and food manufacturers have to pay a lot of money to get the Heart Association check mark on the front of their food. And while it's certainly on some foods that are healthier than others, we also see the heart check mark on things like, for example, pretzels. Okay, pretzels, which is not as bad as some other snacks, just refined white flour and salt. Sure, it's low in fat. Sure, it's low in saturated fat. But is that really the heart healthiest option for us? However, on their website, they do have some good information about increasing whole grains. More information from Medline Plus. And then there's a pretty cool fiber-o-meter. You can also download fiber apps to track your fiber intake. This one's from WebMD, and I think it's pretty comprehensive. It's driven by the USDA nutrient database. I love fiber so much that I have a blog on fiber called fiberisthefuture.com. So for all of your fiber-related reading needs, I would invite you to visit that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up and email me. So I'd like to go ahead. I know some people are probably going to head out as it's getting late, but I would like to open it up to questions if you have any with regards to some of the stuff we've talked about. In the back, sir.
Cheerios ingredient includes trisodium phosphate, which I associate as a household cleaner.
Trisodium phosphate is a household cleaner. I am not a chemist, so I did not know it was a household cleaner. That's a little, I'll have to double check that. Might not be the cleanest ingredient list to have up there. But better than Cinnamon Toast Crunch, right? Oh, why do they put the trisodium phosphate in cereal? It's probably as a preservative is what I would guess. Does anyone else know with a chemistry background? Yes?
The reason I stopped eating Cheerios, and it's still my favorite cereal, is that my understanding that in the greenhouses it's really dirty, and that they don't do much to clean it before they turn it into a Cheerio, and maybe that's why they have some cleaning products.
Which you could argue promotes your immunity as you're exposed to more pathogens too, but good point. Question up here in the front.
I mean, for lack of anything, if you really do have a poor diet, isn't like supplementing like fiber gummies or maybe vitamins, is that better than nothing?
So the question is, and it's an excellent question, if you do have a low fiber diet, wouldn't supplementing with something like fiber gummies or Metamucil be helpful? From a gut health standpoint, if you are constipated, yes, those fiber supplements with a lot of water and increased physical activity will help promote motility, but they will not help your blood sugar, they will not make you feel fuller for longer, and they will not lower your LDL cholesterol, which, why would we cut out all of those health benefits? They're helpful for what they're intended for, which is for gut health, but not certainly for heart health or blood sugar management.
Psyllium husk.
Psyllium husk, insoluble fiber, also very helpful for motility, gets things going. And there's a couple kind of, we say like fibers that we're not really sure why they're so helpful. If, for example, prunes, you often hear I work with older populations. They're constipated prunes or prune juice. In bran, in psyllium husk, in prunes, there's certain types of carbohydrate that actually promote motility more so than other ingredients do. So it's not just the fiber, it may be the sugars in those products as well that travel more quickly through the gut, promoting more motility. In the back.
I have a question regarding other countries and white rice or pasta and in comparison to the whole grains that we're talking about now. Is it just more a quote-unquote regional?
So the question is about refined grains and pastas, like, for example, having white or polished rice and white pastas. All of China and Japan. A couple of other factors. Activity levels. Especially in developing countries, they tend to be more involved in manual labor, so they do not sit in front of computers all day or very interesting nutrition lectures like this all day. But additionally, what do we do to our pasta? We put a ton of butter on it, we put salt in it, we dehydrate it, we sell it as rice-a-roni or whatever it is. Whereas perhaps in those environments, they're having it along with olive oil. It might be a refined pasta. But if you look at the Mediterranean diet, no one says eat more whole wheat pasta, but they have lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, lower intake of meats. So while I think fiber is important, I do think we have to look at it in the context of the entire spectrum of diet and lifestyle. Question here.
I read the Harvard findings, and of course they're promoting eating a lot of fiber, but their results were that they've done 2 large studies of the relationship of prostate cancer, and not prostate, colon cancer with fiber, and it indicates that they can find the relationship.
So the statement is that on Harvard studies have found with regard to colon cancer, a high cereal intake, or was it whole grain? Whole fiber intake. Okay, 100,000 people that didn't find a correlation. And I would certainly argue that there's large-scale studies that haven't found a correlation, but I've never seen a large-scale study where a diet high in fiber increased your risk of those types of cancer either. So it's kind of neutral, but no one's saying these are bad products, and there are so few things out there that we can say that about. Very surprised by the results. question here in the front?
My question is about mixing. You know, I heard that if you are eating fruits, you should not mix with vegetables. But my main question is this. You know, I'm concerned when I'm making a salad, for example, I put all kinds of vegetables, including cilantro. And then also I have red cabbage and some other things, all kinds. Can I mix them?
So the question is about mixing fruits and vegetables or mixing vegetables. I haven't ever heard of not being able to mix those. You know, occasionally from a micronutrient standpoint, you know, iron and calcium together would offset each other. But to be honest, I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't mix fruits and vegetables together or why you wouldn't put cilantro in a salad with red cabbage unless you know, personally had an intolerance to it, which some people certainly have intolerance to cilantro. But beyond that, I can't think of a reason why you would want to avoid that. Is there a question over here?
How do the gluten-free products compare in terms of fiber?
Okay, great question. How do gluten-free products compare in terms of fiber? A lot of the gluten-free products that are marketed directly to people with celiac disease are oftentimes just gluten-free versions of foods we shouldn't be eating that much of to begin with. Refined breads, cakes, cookies, pies, muffins. Yeah, you want to have those in small amounts, but if you look at some of the naturally occurring gluten-free grains that are out there, you don't have to do anything to them to make them palatable, and yet they are just like whole grains in that they're high in fiber. So especially for people newly diagnosed with celiac, I oftentimes advise them, stay away from the middle aisles. Shop the perimeter, shop in bins, look at new whole grains that are naturally gluten-free. And a lot of people gain weight when they go on a gluten-free diet because they go wild for these products that have a lot of fat and added sugars to them as well. So for the most part, it can be done like all diets, well and not well. Question here.
Could you point us to the website for that very interesting but small complex chart?
Okay, that's a great question. I have good eyes and I have trouble with that one. So I'd be happy to send you the one-page PDF. I can send it to Dr. Barron or to Matt. But this is called the Summary of Convincing and Probable Judgments. And it's a combination between American Institute for Cancer Research and the World Cancer Research Fund. And if you email me, I'd be happy to send you the whole report. It has beautiful graphics, much more than we could go into here. And this in a big size on a big screen is really impressive to see the relationship between diet and cancer. I'm sorry it doesn't translate so great here.
Do whole grains affect mineral absorption? For example, brown rice and phytic acid.
Great question. Do whole grains affect mineral absorption? Yes, to some degree there are compounds like phytic acid and oxalates and even tannins and certain things like teas that can reduce iron and calcium absorption. And what can be done about that? Have a variety of whole grains and have other sources of iron and calcium are separate from your whole grains. But the degree to which it's affected is very individualized. Some people, if you're pregnant, you're going to absorb way more calcium than if you're not pregnant, even with the presence of phytic acid or oxalates. So it's kind of hard to quantify.
A labeling question. If you said that fiber has no calories. So if on the label it says a certain amount of calories and also fiber, then you can assume then that there's something else that accounts for the calories.
So the question is, if you see fiber on calories, you say that we don't get energy, quote unquote, calories from fiber-containing foods. Yes, it would be something else, and it would be the fat, the carb, or the protein, or if there's alcohol in it, the alcohol that contributes the calories. Question?
Yes, could you speak a little bit about this phenomenon of celiac disease? In other words, somebody could get a reaction to foods that they've eaten all their lives when they get over 65 or something like that?
The question is about celiac disease. Is it possible that someone who's been fine with gluten-containing products, which is the protein found in wheat, rye, and barley, that you could just automatically get celiac disease? It's certainly true. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease that's thought to affect the stats differ between 1 in 100 or 1 in 133 people in North America. But it is true that you can develop it later in life. It tends to be more prevalent among people who have autoimmune disease, things like Sjogren's or type 1 diabetes or lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. But also it's small numbers, but it can happen that a traumatic event, for example, pregnancy, can actually induce celiac disease as well. So there's been incidents of motor vehicle accidents, and then the person has celiac after the fact. Like all autoimmune diseases, it's very much not understood why it occurs, and the only therapy for celiac disease is lifelong adherence to a gluten-free diet. So it's one of the few diseases that we can say, we know without a shadow of a doubt, this is what you have to do from a dietary standpoint. People often ask questions too, if you see a lot of your friends or people are going gluten-free when they don't have celiac disease, and what's the deal with that? Well, if you've been eating hundreds or thousands of extra calories from refined white wheat products, and then all of a sudden you cut them all out of your diet, yeah, you're going to lose weight, and you're probably going to feel better, but you might not have celiac disease. Now, if you replace those foods, as we talked earlier, with a lot of cakes and pies and cookies that are gluten-free, you'd gain the weight back. There's nothing wrong about going on a gluten-free diet if you don't have celiac, but I would encourage you, if you think you do have celiac disease, to not self-diagnose. It's important for you to get a diagnosis so that you can have, if down the road there are other treatments that become available, you want to have that confirmation. And in order to get tested for celiac disease, in order for the assays to come back positive, the antibodies, you have to have some gluten in your system. So you actually need to eat gluten-containing foods for a few days leading up to at least when you have the antibody blood test so that you don't get a false negative. You want those antibodies to show up, which is the first step in getting diagnosed with celiac disease. Okay? And it's also important to remember that gluten-free is not a fad diet. We really do a disservice to all the people that have celiac disease when we act like this is some sort of flash in the pan that you might try for a day or two. Celiac disease is a very serious condition with very unfortunate side effects if it's not treated, and it's mandatory that those people be on the gluten-free diet. So while people might trend in and out of it as a fad diet, it really is an important therapeutic approach for people who truly do have celiac disease. In the back, sir.
So you maintain that oats are gluten-free?
So the question is, do you maintain that oats are gluten-free? The rule of thumb is you have to assume, unless otherwise stated, that oats are processed in a facility where they may have come into contact with other gluten-containing ingredients. So while there certainly are gluten-free and specified gluten-free and tested and proven gluten-free oat products, if it doesn't say gluten-free, you should err on the side of safety and assume it's been cross-contaminated with gluten. Keeping in mind that some people are so hypersensitive to gluten that so much as a crumb of regular wheat bread can set off side effects or symptoms. On the other hand, lots of people are asymptomatic. If they eat gluten-containing foods, they don't feel so horrible, but it's actually doing damage to their intestinal villi. It's a great question. Yes, sir?
How healthy are raisins added to, say, oatmeal?
Question, how healthy are raisins added to oatmeal? Raisins are concentrated grapes, so much like where you can drink 100 calories of orange juice a lot quicker than it takes to peel and eat 2 whole oranges, you can eat a whole lot of concentrated grapes in the form of raisins much more quickly. They tend not to have as much fiber as some other things that I would add to oatmeal. I tend to recommend things like berries, particularly blackberries and raspberries. Next to pears, those are the highest fiber fruit, kind of per calorie. So if you're working on feeling full without a lot of added sugar, you would go for berries over raisins. But especially I work with athlete populations, they want a lot of sugar and a lot of concentrated nutrition in a small amount of food. Raisins would be a better option for them. Some raisins, like you see in the Kellogg's Raisin brand, have sugar added to them. If the Post Raisin brand, the reason people don't like it as much as Kellogg's is because those raisins in Post don't have sugar added to them. All right, maybe time for one more question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about lettuce and chard and fibers and leafy greens. Do they have, we used to say roughage. Do they have fiber or?
So great question about leafy greens. Things like lettuce, kale, collard greens, mustard greens, they do contain fiber, but because they don't contain a whole lot of anything, to be honest, they're really good for you. We say the darker in color they are, the more nutritious they are. So if we look at iceberg on one end of the spectrum and kale on the other, you would want to go for kale or spinach. They're decent sources of fiber, but like all vegetables, they're actually quite low in fiber per serving compared to fruits, but they're also lower in calories. So, you have kale with the 30 to 50 calories, maybe 1 or 2 grams of fiber. I know when I make kale, I make a whole bunch of it, boil it down, eat it all. You're going to be getting 5, 6, 7 grams there too, not to mention all of the other micronutrients. They're better sources of iron and some B vitamins as well. So they're really good sources of nutrition and certainly better than lettuce.
And a quick other thing is, you showed the quick oats.
Yeah.
Like if one eats whole oats, whole rolled oats that are organic, presumably that's more fiber.
Okay, so if you eat whole steel-cut oats, or if you're comparing quick cooking to traditional oats, the nutritionals are exactly the same. If you look at steel-cut oats, yes, they actually do have some higher levels of B vitamins as well as fiber. I put the quick cooking oats up there as a nice alternative for the packaged oatmeal fanatics out there to show them that yes, you can make it yourself. Now, if you're so inclined to take the time to make steel cut oats, I don't know if you guys have tried slow cooker cooked oats recipes where you put them out the night before and you wake up in the morning and you have beautiful, delicious steel cut oatmeal. That's a little bit higher in fiber. Exactly the breakdown per grams, I'm not sure. It's a matter of time. Some people just don't want to go through the effort because they do take more time to cook. You can, however, buy already pre-cooked steel cut oats from places like Trader Joe's, though. So, well, thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next week.